David Mitchell was 32 years old when his younger brother collapsed in a grocery store parking lot in Portland, Oregon. The call came on a Thursday afternoon while David was teaching a high school chemistry class. His mother's voice was shaking so badly he could barely understand her. Ethan, his 28-year-old brother, was in the emergency room. Kidney failure. Both kidneys. Critical condition. David left his classroom mid-lecture, drove 90 miles an hour to the hospital, and arrived to find his little brother hooked up to machines, pale as paper, barely conscious. The doctors said Ethan needed a transplant immediately. Without it, he had maybe 6 months. The waiting list was years long. David didn't hesitate. He told the doctors to test him that day. He was a match. 3 weeks later, David donated his kidney to save his brother's life. It was the easiest decision he ever made. 10 years later, going through Ethan's belongings after his sudden death, David would find a medical file that made him wish he'd let his brother die. This isn't a story about sacrifice. It's a story about what happens when the person you saved never deserved saving at all. David and Ethan Mitchell grew up in a small house in Eugene, Oregon, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep them fed. Their father had left when Ethan was 2, and David, 4 years older, had stepped into the role without being asked. He walked Ethan to school. He made sure Ethan did his homework. He protected Ethan from bullies, from their mother's occasional boyfriends, from anything that might hurt him. Ethan worshipped David the way little brothers do, followed him everywhere, wanted to be just like him. They were close in the way siblings are when they only have each other. As they got older, their paths diverged. David was the responsible one, the straight-A student who became a teacher, who married his college girlfriend Amy, who lived a quiet, steady life. Ethan was the wild one, the charmer, the kid who could talk his way out of anything. He drifted through jobs, relationships, cities. He'd show up at David's house every few months, broke and asking for help, and David always gave it. That's what brothers did. That's what family meant. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, we'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. When Ethan collapsed that Thursday, the doctors told the family his kidneys had failed catastrophically. They asked about family history, about genetic conditions, about anything that might explain it. David's mother said there was nothing. No kidney disease in the family. No genetic markers. The doctors seemed puzzled but didn't push. What mattered was finding a donor. David tested as a perfect match, and the surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Those 3 weeks were strange. Ethan was weak, frightened, more vulnerable than David had ever seen him. He apologized constantly for being a burden, for ruining David's life, for asking too much. David told him to shut up. He said, "You're my brother. This isn't even a question." Amy, David's wife, was supportive but worried. She asked the doctors about risks, about David's long-term health, about what losing a kidney would mean. The doctors were honest. David would be fine, probably. He'd need to be more careful about his health, avoid certain medications, monitor his remaining kidney closely. There was a small chance of complications, of his remaining kidney failing someday, but it was minimal. Amy asked David if he was sure. David said he'd never been more sure of anything. The surgery went well. David woke up in recovery with a long scar across his abdomen and his mother crying grateful tears beside his bed. Ethan's surgery took longer, but the transplant was successful. Within days, Ethan's color returned. Within weeks, he was walking around, laughing, talking about all the things he was going to do with his second chance at life. He told David he'd never forget this, that he owed David everything, that he was going to turn his life around and make David proud. David believed him. For the first year, Ethan kept his promises. He got a steady job at a marketing firm, rented an apartment, stayed in close contact with David and their mother. He seemed changed, grateful, serious about living differently. David felt vindicated. The sacrifice had been worth it. He'd saved his brother's life, and Ethan was finally becoming the person David always knew he could be. Amy noticed David was more tired than before, that he got sick more easily, that his energy wasn't what it used to be. The doctors said it was normal adjustment. David's remaining kidney was compensating. He just needed to take care of himself. Years passed. David turned 40. Ethan seemed to be thriving. He'd been promoted at work, was dating someone seriously, talked about settling down. David's life continued quietly. He taught, he came home to Amy, they tried unsuccessfully to have children and eventually accepted it would just be the two of them. His health was mostly fine, though he had to be careful about infections, about staying hydrated, about monitoring his kidney function regularly. It was a small price. Ethan was alive. That was what mattered. Then, 10 years after the transplant, Ethan died. It was sudden, unexpected, devastating. A car accident on a rainy night. He was 42 years old. David got the call from a police officer and felt the world tilt sideways. At the funeral, David delivered the eulogy. He talked about Ethan's charm, his second chance, his gratitude. He talked about brotherhood and sacrifice and love. He cried in front of 200 people. Afterward, their mother asked David to help her clean out Ethan's apartment. She couldn't face doing it alone. David said yes. Ethan's apartment was nicer than David expected. Expensive furniture, big television, closets full of designer clothes. David wondered how Ethan afforded it on a marketing salary but didn't think much of it. They spent a weekend sorting through belongings, packing things to donate, setting aside items their mother wanted to keep. On the second day, David was going through Ethan's desk when he found a locked filing cabinet. He searched for a key, couldn't find one, and finally used a screwdriver to pry it open. Inside were files. Medical files. David pulled them out, thinking they might be related to the transplant, records his mother might need. He opened the first folder and started reading. What he found made his hands start shaking. The first document was a hospital intake form from 9 years earlier, a year after the transplant. Ethan had been admitted to an emergency room in Seattle for a drug overdose. Heroin. David read it 3 times, certain he was misunderstanding. There had to be a mistake. Ethan had never mentioned Seattle, never mentioned drugs. But the name was right. The birth date was right. It was Ethan. If this story has your heart racing, comment "I'm still watching." David kept reading. There were more files. Treatment center intake forms. Relapse reports. Narcotics prescriptions. A timeline emerged that made David feel sick. Ethan had been using opioids since his early 20s, years before the kidney failure. He'd hidden it perfectly, lied to everyone, maintained the facade of a functional life while slowly destroying himself. The kidney failure hadn't been genetic or mysterious. It had been caused by years of intravenous drug use, infections, damage that accumulated until his kidneys simply gave out. The doctors had probably suspected, but without Ethan admitting it, they couldn't prove it. And Ethan had never told anyone. Not the doctors. Not their mother. Not David. He'd let David donate a kidney to fix damage Ethan had caused himself, damage from an addiction he had no intention of stopping. Because there, in the files, was proof that Ethan had relapsed 6 months after the transplant. He'd gone to rehab twice in the following years. He'd overdosed 3 more times. He'd continued using, on and off, for the entire 10 years after David saved his life. The expensive apartment, the nice clothes, the seemingly successful career. David found bank statements showing unexplained cash deposits, records of debts, evidence of a life funded in ways that had nothing to do with marketing. David sat on the floor of Ethan's apartment, surrounded by files, and felt something crack open inside him. His mother was in the other room, packing up Ethan's clothes, crying softly. She didn't know. David realized Ethan had hidden this from everyone, had taken his secrets to the grave, had let them all believe he'd been given a mysterious illness and made the most of his second chance. It was all a lie. Every grateful word. Every promise to turn his life around. Every time Ethan had looked David in the eye and thanked him for saving his life. David had sacrificed his health, his future, his kidney, for a brother who had destroyed his own through choices he refused to stop making. And Ethan had let him. Had watched David go through surgery, through recovery, years of careful health management, and had never once told him the truth. David thought about all the times his remaining kidney had struggled, the infections he'd fought, the fatigue he'd learned to live with. He thought about the children he and Amy couldn't have, the adoption agencies that had rejected them partly because of David's compromised health status. He thought about the life he'd adjusted, the risks he'd accepted, all for a brother who hadn't deserved it. David didn't tell his mother. He couldn't. She was grieving her son, remembering him as troubled but ultimately redeemed. Finding out the truth would destroy her. So David took the files home, hid them in his garage, and told his mother he hadn't found anything important. At Ethan's apartment, he'd grabbed the files and walked out, leaving his mother to box up the clothes, the books, the surface life that meant nothing. Amy found him that night sitting in their garage, the files spread out on his workbench. She read them in silence. When she finished, she looked at David and asked what he was going to do. David said he didn't know. Amy said, "You saved his life, and he threw it away. And he let you sacrifice yourself for nothing." David corrected her. He said, "Not for nothing. For a lie." The anger came slowly. At first, David felt numb, disconnected, like the information couldn't quite penetrate. But over the following weeks, as he returned to work and tried to resume normal life, the rage built. He'd catch himself in the middle of teaching a chemistry lesson and suddenly be unable to breathe, overwhelmed by the thought of Ethan's betrayal. He started having nightmares. In them, he was back in the hospital, waking up from surgery, and Ethan was standing over his bed laughing. David went to therapy. The therapist asked him what he was most angry about. David said everything. The lies. The manipulation. The fact that Ethan had let him make a sacrifice based on false information. The fact that if David had known the truth, known that Ethan's kidney failure was self-inflicted and that Ethan had no intention of staying clean, he might not have donated. The therapist asked, might not? Or wouldn't have? David sat with that question for a long time. Finally, he admitted he didn't know. Even knowing what Ethan had done, even knowing about the addiction and the lies, David wasn't sure he could have let his brother die. That was the worst part. The knowledge that even with the truth, he probably would have made the same choice. Because Ethan was his brother. Because David had spent his whole life protecting him. Because walking away would have violated something fundamental in who David was. The therapist said, "So you're angry at yourself as much as you're angry at Ethan." David realized that was true. He was angry at Ethan for lying. But he was also angry at himself for being the kind of person who could be lied to, who would sacrifice himself for someone who didn't deserve it, who loved so completely that he couldn't see the person he loved clearly. Months passed. David's anger didn't fade, but it changed shape. He started thinking about Ethan differently, not as the brother who betrayed him, but as a person who had been desperately sick and unable to ask for help in any honest way. The addiction had been the sickness. The lies had been symptoms. Ethan had probably hated himself, had probably wanted to tell the truth but couldn't face the shame, couldn't risk David saying no. So he'd constructed an elaborate deception, had let David save him while knowing he didn't deserve saving, and had spent 10 years trying and failing to live up to the gift he'd been given. It didn't excuse the lies. But it contextualized them. David found himself wondering what those 10 years had been like for Ethan, living with the knowledge of what he'd done, struggling with addiction while carrying the weight of David's sacrifice. It couldn't have been easy. Maybe Ethan had punished himself every day. Maybe that was part of why he'd kept using. Survivor's guilt mixed with addict's shame, creating a cycle Ethan couldn't escape. David would never know. Ethan had taken those answers with him. 1 year after Ethan's death, David went to his grave. He hadn't visited since the funeral. He stood there looking at the headstone, thinking about everything he'd learned, everything he'd lost, everything he'd felt over the past 12 months. He thought about the scar on his abdomen, the kidney he'd given, the health complications he'd live with forever. He thought about the brother he'd loved, the brother he'd thought he was saving, and the brother who had actually existed beneath all the lies. And standing there, David realized something. He wasn't sorry he'd done it. Even knowing everything, even carrying the anger and the betrayal and the grief, he wasn't sorry. Because the alternative, letting Ethan die when David could have saved him, would have been worse. David would have spent his life wondering if things could have been different, if Ethan might have gotten clean, if those 10 years, flawed and dishonest as they were, might have contained moments of real joy or connection or meaning for Ethan. And they had. David had seen Ethan laugh. Had seen him try. Had seen him struggle. Those 10 years were worth something, even if they weren't what David had thought they were. David knelt down and touched the headstone. He said out loud, "I'm still angry at you. I don't know if I'll ever stop being angry. But I'd do it again. Even knowing what I know now, I'd do it again. Because you're my brother, and I couldn't let you die. Even if you didn't deserve it. Even if you lied to me. Even if it cost me everything." Saying it out loud didn't heal anything. But it clarified something. David's sacrifice hadn't been wasted because of Ethan's lies. It had been exactly what David thought it was, an act of love from a brother who couldn't do anything else. What Ethan did with that gift, how he squandered it or struggled with it or failed to live up to it, that was Ethan's burden to carry, not David's. David had done what he could do. He'd given Ethan 10 more years. What Ethan did with them was his own hidden chapter, one David would never fully understand. David drove home. Amy asked how it went. David said, "I think I'm okay." She asked if he meant it. David said he thought so. The anger was still there, but it had somewhere to go now. He could be angry at Ethan for lying and still love him for being his brother. He could regret the cost of his sacrifice and still believe it was the right thing to do. He could live with the complexity of it, the mess of it, the impossibility of clean answers. David Mitchell is 44 years old now. He still teaches high school chemistry. He still monitors his remaining kidney carefully. He still lives with the consequences of a choice he made 12 years ago to save a brother who didn't tell him the truth. But he's made peace with it, mostly. Because here's what David learned, standing at his brother's grave a year after finding those files: you can't control what other people do with the gifts you give them. You can only control whether you give them. David gave his brother 10 years. Ethan filled those years with struggle, relapse, lies, and probably more pain than David will ever know. But they were still 10 years. 10 years Ethan wouldn't have had. And somewhere in those years, in the spaces between the addiction and the deception, there were probably moments when Ethan was glad to be alive. David has to believe that. He has to believe his sacrifice meant something, even if it didn't mean what he thought it would. This is the hidden chapter of David Mitchell's life. Not the surgery or the sacrifice, those were public, celebrated, understood. The hidden chapter is what came after. The decade of living with a lie he didn't know he was living with. The year of rage after discovering the truth. The slow, painful process of forgiving a dead brother who couldn't apologize or explain or make it right. The choice to keep loving someone who hurt you, not because they deserve it, but because you can't help it. If you've ever sacrificed something for someone who didn't deserve it, if you've ever been lied to by someone you saved, if you've ever had to decide whether love is conditional or if it just is, regardless of whether it's returned or respected or earned, then you understand David's hidden chapter. It's the chapter where you learn that doing the right thing doesn't guarantee the right outcome. That loving someone doesn't mean they'll love you back the same way. That sacrifice, real sacrifice, costs you something even when it works, and costs you even more when the person you sacrificed for wastes what you gave them. David doesn't regret saving his brother. But he'll carry the weight of that choice, and the truth he learned too late, for the rest of his life. Some gifts can't be taken back. Some truths come too late to change anything. Some hidden chapters never get a resolution, just an ending. This was David's. What would you have done? If you found out, 10 years later, that the person you saved had lied to you about why they needed saving, would you regret it? Or would you make the same choice again, knowing what you know now? Drop your honest answer in the comments. There's no right answer. Only the answer you could live with. And if this story made you think about someone you've sacrificed for, someone who maybe didn't deserve it or didn't appreciate it or threw it away, know that your sacrifice still mattered. Not because of what they did with it, but because of who you were when you gave it. That's the only part you control. Thanks for being here. We'll see you in the next hidden chapter.